At this point, Georgia Tech has wrapped up its first full semester of virtual learning, and heading into another semester where I'm going to be taking a lot of online classes again, I decided this was a good opportunity to talk about how Tech has been handling virtual learning thus far. Before I get started, though this is primarily based off my own experiences taking 5 classes virtually this fall, I realize that that's a pretty small sample size, so I'll also bring in some other perspectives from things I've heard from other students with different course loads, just to try to keep this video a little bit more balanced. For the most part, my professors did a pretty good job of adjusting their class structures and also their expectations to account for the fact that we were going to be online this semester. This meant anything ranging from having fewer tests to offering more flexibility for late assignments, or even just removing some assignments that might unfairly burden some students who maybe weren't on campus. Even if you didn't end up having any extenuating circumstances, there was also definitely a peace of mind in knowing that your professors were being more flexible in the event that something actually did come up in your life. Though this was mostly the case for me, unfortunately, some other people had very different experiences. For example, some professors decided to add additional work and extend the duration of tests, effectively making the class more intensive than it would be in a typical semester. In other cases, students in different time zones had to take tests at very late or very early times, simply because the professor wanted the entire class to take the test at the exact same time. Now, it's definitely possible that some professors didn't even realize they were making their classes more challenging when they were transitioning them to being online courses, but this is actually a great example of why it's important that professors send out mid-semester surveys so that they can get feedback from their students. Once again, my overall experience with this was actually quite positive, but depending on your time zone and your professors, just realize that your mileage may vary. Throughout the course of the semester, I ended up experiencing 3 different form factors for lectures: required live classes, optional live classes, and pre-recorded lectures. At least for me, pre-recorded lectures had 3 main benefits. First, you could watch them whenever best fit into your schedule. Second, you could go back immediately if you happen to miss something. And third, for the professors who speak slowly, you could watch them at 1.5x speed. Predictably, the biggest drawback was the inability to get instant clarification, and without a professor actually sitting there interacting with you, it started to feel a little bit like you were just watching some random online class you'd found on the internet. At this point, I'll transition away from pre-recorded classes to live lectures, and in my case, I didn't have any issues with this because I was living in the same time zone as my professors. However, if you're someone who's living across the world, this could actually be an issue for you because you'd be trying to sleep, and that's when your class would be. Optional live classes made up the majority of my schedule, and I think this struck a pretty nice balance between the two things, but unfortunately it also means that a lot of people didn't show up to class, which kind of eliminated a lot of the normal discussion you would get in a class. In terms of how the classes were actually being run, the 2 most common formats were using a digital whiteboard or using slides, although I did have one recitation that was purely based on discussion. Digital whiteboard learning seemed to be highly dependent on the professor's handwriting, and you also seemed to move a lot slower just because you were sitting around waiting for them to write everything out on their little tablet. On the other hand, slides ended up being great for going over things after the fact, but it was kind of hard to go over some challenging examples without using a whiteboard, without it seeming like you were skipping over the details and just doing things at a high level. Then again, normal classes often struggle to find this balance, but it just felt a lot more apparent this semester. One of the biggest changes this semester was that professors can't really proctor in-person exams anymore. Naturally, the biggest concern is around student integrity and making sure people aren't cheating on tests, but obviously that's a lot easier to enforce when you can actually see people while they're taking the test. All of my tests this semester were either open book or just followed the honor system in terms of expecting you not to cheat, and I'm pretty sure from what I've heard this is the preferred method of taking tests for most students at Tech. Unfortunately, this opens up the door to things like unfair collaboration, looking up answers, or actually posting questions online, and there's been reports at Tech of these sorts of things happening. As a result, some professors have required the use of software that uses the webcam to watch you while you're taking the test, and it can also make sure you're not looking up answers online. Though this obviously does cut down the likelihood of cheating, from what I've heard, most students don't like this, either because it kind of feels like an invasion of privacy, or just because sometimes you can't control what's going on in your background and it'll look suspicious if you have people moving around behind you. Personally, I think this is one of the areas that could use the most improvement so that students and professors can reach a solution they're both happy with in terms of flexibility, but also ensuring that people aren't cheating. Of course, it wouldn't be online learning without some technical difficulties. For the most part, especially as time went on, there really were not that many technical difficulties, or they just weren't that big of a deal, but this also did depend on the professor and the platform you were using. Probably one of the biggest and most inconvenient issues that I ran into was when the professor and the students were having trouble getting into a class, and even once they eventually did get in, they would run into more technical difficulties that would require them to drop out of the call and then come back in. Another issue that I experienced firsthand was related to interacting live. This actually happened back in the spring semester, but basically my group was going to present something and it was my turn to speak. I unmuted myself and nobody could hear me. Now, I've seen this happen a number of times, and fortunately people tend to be pretty understanding when this does occur, but it just adds a little bit more strain and stress to your group calls and classes. Ultimately, I don't think the technical difficulties, at least for me, have been too bad, but it definitely has had a negative effect on productivity, and as a result, we're wasting more time in class, which means professors are either trying to rush to get everything in, or they're just holding everyone after the end of class. The last key point I'll bring up is that it feels like Georgia Tech as a whole doesn't really have a ton of standardization between different classes and different professors, which could be interpreted as a good thing or a bad thing. On the one hand, they could force everyone to run their classes in a certain way and everyone could hate it, but I do think a lot of professors and students could benefit from a little more consistency between all their classes. I only ended up using 2 different platforms this semester, Teams and BlueJeans, but I know some other people that were using WebEx and maybe some other platforms, and this can be a little bit annoying to have to keep switching between different platforms for each and every class. Going back to a previous point, testing has been very professor dependent, and it definitely seems like some classes were just left to experiment with different things in the hopes that something would work and click well, but in the meantime they just had to try to figure something out and hope that things did not crash and burn. When I was thinking about this point, I realized that historically professors have had a lot of control over how they run their classes, and I'm not suggesting we completely take that away, but I also think there's a lot of professors who would appreciate having a little bit more guidance from Georgia Tech about how to best run their classes, since after all this is new to a lot of them as well. Depending on how long we keep doing virtual learning, it's possible that Tech will roll out some new guidelines or policies to help professors out, but in the meantime, it definitely feels like they're on their own in terms of figuring out what the best way of running things is. Alright guys, if you found that video helpful, please hit the thumbs up button. I really do appreciate it, and if you're new here, consider subscribing for new videos every single week. That's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next